We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Take your own advice.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No delusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Jerry, find your happy president.
Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
This is Jeremy Rothe-Kushel.
All right, as we continue in our process of circling back to Chapter 4 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson, we're going to dig back into Bibi, My Story. As you pointed out, Jeremy, My Story, Not My Struggle, by Benjamin Netanyahu, and a couple of three particular portions that deal with things that we've been analyzing and trying to make sense of for a few years here on the AnteDote.
Yes, and so we'll just go through these. One is we're going to go back to 2013 and Obama coming to Israel and a meeting with Netanyahu. And then this is earlier in the year of 2013 in the run-up to one of the key early moment in the Syrian civil war in terms of this gas attack in Duma, I think. And there's some forensics here that Netanyahu puts forth that I've never heard before that really help further flesh out what we had suspected and analyzed from the logical and geopolitical strategy side of this in terms of the way that the United States and Russia acted as a good cop, bad cop, depending on how you see the situation in terms of facilitating the potential actual, at the very least, Likud Israeli security state interests in the Syrian civil war that lined up with what we kept pointing out in terms of the actual text of the geopolitical strategy put forth in the clean break paper that was presented to Bibi as he was right after he was originally became prime minister for the first time in 1996. Remember, with the help with Finkelstein, there's a whole controversy about which way it's pronounced. Remember, going back to our episode on Finky and the kids. And this will help lay out some more forensics here that actually point directly, I would say, to Netanyahu admitting that he was the key broker in terms of how this all resolved, you might say. And so that's one moment. And then another moment is we will be getting into the beginnings of Netanyahu talking about, really, I would say, the 11/9 conspiracy, as we touched on last time, in terms of the question about Iran, the Iran nuclear deal, the key Arab leaders in terms of Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed being these key allies to Bibi in terms of what eventually become the Abraham Accords. And then finally, some more forensics of what we maybe is one of the later videos that I think that we did, recordings that we did before our YouTube channel was shut down, I believe, where we talked about the Obama's last push towards some kind of framework for a resolution of the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict in terms of actual borders and a Palestinian state, and with a capital in East Jerusalem, and so that's a piece, and then finally we have the question of what was actually going on in the final run-up to the 11/9 operation and the 2016 election, and then all of the surrounding aspects of Michael Flynn and this key UN vote at that time, and then Netanyahu's operations in relationship to all of that. And so before I give this back, I'd have to give this book back to the library. Someone has it on reserve. And maybe in a couple days. So I feel like that we should just flesh out these key forensic points first.
All right, sounds good. And it's good to get this straight from the horse's mouth, as the saying goes, with regards to these things. And I mean, Netanyahu is about as close to the horse's mouth in this regard as you could get.
And what you will see too, that in terms of the question of this key second vote in the UN towards the end of Obama's time as president, the you'll see Netanyahu pull back the Israeli ambassadors from Ukraine at the time, because Ukraine was going to support this. Apparently, that was going to be brought forth by Egypt, and so there's some more background there, I think, in terms of what's going on to this day. But we'll get there. All right, this is Bibi, My Story by Benjamin Netanyahu. This is page 498. Quote, Obama landed in Israel on March 20th, 2013, and his visit was a great success. President Perez and I, along with an A-list of Israeli VIPs, received Obama in a red carpet reception in Ben Gurion Airport. After the official speeches, Obama and I walked to a nearby Iron Dome battery, specially positioned for the president's inspection. As we marched on the tarmac, Obama took off his jacket and swung it casually over his shoulder. Instinctively, I did the same. If someone takes off his tie in your presence, you do the same. Why not with a jacket, too? The world press now had a photo of the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Israel walking chummily in the sunshine. This was a good beginning. Obama came that evening to a private dinner at the Prime Minister's residence. Sarah, Yair, and I greeted him warmly at the entrance. Standing for a photograph with Sarah in the middle, he quipped, quote, a rose among the thorns, unquote. When Avner came a little later and told him he had attended the Lollapalooza music festival in Obama's hometown of Chicago, Obama was genuinely pleased. They get me. Okay. In the brief press conference outside, he was gracious about the hospitality he received and thanked Sarah especially, noting about the boys, quote, I informed the Prime Minister that they are very good-looking young men who clearly got their looks from their mother, unquote. We all laughed. Obama was at his best. This congenial spirit continued through dinner. We discussed Iran and the Palestinians, mixing in personal stories from our lives, all in a non-confrontational manner. Sarah joined us for dessert, which was accompanied by a special concert by a leading Israeli songwriter. But the visit wasn't all roses. The next day, Obama gave a speech at Tel Aviv University to a carefully chosen young crowd. Extolling the virtues of an Israeli-Palestinian peace, he more or less encouraged the audience to rise above their leaders. My staff wanted to issue a statement to rebuff, but I let it go. Quote, he said rise above, not rise against, unquote, I joked, not wishing to get into an unnecessary fight. Unquote. But an aside, this is very interesting because this is really what the Palestinian grassroots and Palestinian diaspora has been calling for a long time. That basically the Palestinian Authority and most all of the official Palestinian leadership was actually begun in compromise. That it's basically a lackey of the Israeli security state in many ways. And so this is interesting that there was such pushback from Bibi's people, and that Bibi parsed it by saying if he'd sort of said rise against their leadership, rather than rise above, then maybe I'll push back publicly against him. All right. All right. Now we're at the top of page 499 of Bibi, by My Story by Netanyahu. Quote, in the evening at a large dinner at President Perez's residence. By the way, Perez, godfather of the Israeli nuclear program, probably the original handler of Arnon Milchan. Key Lakam, scientific espionage, industrial espionage agent and producer of Oliver Stone's JFK film.
Put in a satellite or a pre-taped video at the Dennis Ross event at the Kansas City Public Library.
That would have been that would have been months, just a few months actually before Perez's death in May. That was May 9th, 2016. You're right, and that they gave this video to the gathering. It was a very personal video that Perez had offered up to that event and to celebrate Truman in Israel. And remember, that was the Truman Library Institute, so the official fundraising part and institutional part of the Truman Library, and then the Jewish Community Foundation of Kansas City beginning what was to be a lecture series on Truman and Israel. And one of the other intro speakers was Truman's grandson. All right. Quote, in the evening, at a large dinner at President Perez's residence, Obama reverted to a more moderate tone, even winking at Sarah and me when some of the speeches given by the Israelis in attendance got particularly long-winded. Unquote. By the way, remember, there's also a very close relationship of Perez and his institute. I think it's even called a Peace Institute with the Maxwell Talpiot twins. I think it's Isabel specifically maybe has the closest relationship with the Perez Institute. Quote, for me, the visit was marked by two important Obama statements, one public and the other private. The Syrian civil war was raging at this time. When we faced the press in the prime minister's residence, Obama was asked point blank about reports that the Syrian government had possibly used chemical weapons against opponents of Assad's regime a day earlier. Is this a red line for you? A journalist asked. I have made clear that the use of chemical weapons is a game changer, Obama said, a reaffirmed threat heard round the world. He had first drawn a red line on this issue a few months earlier in a White House statement. Would he make good on it if it were proven that chemical weapons were actually used in Syria? Time would tell. And it did. 5 months later, Assad's forces carried out a horrific chemical attack that killed 1,500 civilians. Obama called it, quote, the worst chemical weapons attack of the 21st century, unquote. The entire world was shocked by the footage of little children suffocating to death. All eyes were on Obama. He was scheduled to make a dramatic announcement, unquote. Now, we won't go deep into the forensics and the question of that event itself and the authors of it, and that would take a long time. But we do want to point out that we've been harping on one of the alternative interpretations of that at the time by a person named Yosef Bodansky, who we've identified as very likely a key operative. He comes out of basically an analyst at the Israeli Air Force, but he's very likely some kind of Talpiot communications specialist coming out of Israeli military intelligence and then making his way into the foundation national security world of the United States. He begins, I believe, at JINSA with this key network, people like Michael Ledeen and Stephen Bryan and others. And then Bodansky, we pointed out, publishes his interpretation of that gas attack in Syria on Global Research. And we will link to both his article, which is quoted, "Did the White House help plan the Syrian chemical attack?" by Yosef Bodansky, Global Research, September 1st, 2013. Defense and Foreign Affairs and oilprice.com. Maybe that's where it was originally published. And then we will also there's an interesting write-up of Bodansky's article in Mother Jones from that year too, September 3rd, 2013, by Kevin Drum, "From the Fever Swamps, Obama Planned the Syrian Gas Attacks." Okay, so we were just noting that this is a very interesting conjunction here of a very specific alternative analysis of the Syrian chemical weapons attack by this very, very obvious long-term Israeli military intelligence agent deep in the heart of the U.S. security establishment for many, many years, and then being picked up and being platformed by global research, which was seen in many ways as a key locus of 9/11 truth, um, alternative research, especially in a Canadian capacity, but then also identified as having very strong Russian sphere, Russian meta narrative ties too. So we picked up on that and didn't quite know exactly how that all fit in here, other than pointing out that this seemed to fit into this question of the architecture of Syrian civil war, and then what would be done in response to in an incident like this, a chemical weapons attack incident in relationship between the management of it, between the United States and Russia, and then the Israeli and neoconservative interests that were stated in the Clean Break paper, where it calls specifically for regime change in Iraq, but it calls for rolling back, some kind of destabilizing in a dirty war, and rolling back specifically. My sense of it was something in relationship to eliminating the Syrian chemical weapons in a national security way. You would see it as a deterrent. It's their WMD. Israel has nukes, and Syria has chemical weapons. They're close to Israel, so it would be seen as the WMD, mutually assured destruction sort of deterrent in that capacity. And so we have always pointed out that virtually none of the alternative media would just point out that the Clean Break paper calls specifically for regime change war TM in the Tulsi Gabbard nomenclature in Iraq, but it calls for a very different kind of intent for the dirty war in Syria. It calls for rolling back, and this, I think, is the actual one of the major geostrategic results that were intended in, especially by this specific Israeli and neoconservative set surrounding the Clean Break paper, in terms of what they were after in the Syrian civil war, dirty war.
And I think misunderstanding, I think it's more than that within some people within what we call alternative media in this interpretation of the clean break. But this is something, this misconception around it at best is something that people take advantage of to this day. Whereas you mentioned Tulsi Gabbard and the regime change wars. Now the U.S. Western, in some circles Israeli, efforts to achieve regime change in Syria are hand in glove. It's the same thing as the U.S. pursuing regime change in Iraq, when, number one, it wasn't the U.S. per se that pursued regime change in Iraq, and number two, regime change by the purveyors of the proponents and architects of the Iraq war of regime change are not actually really advocating for regime change in Syria per se. So it's this misconception at best is taken advantage of and manipulated and weaponized for these narratives that the people who want to remove Assad are the exact same people who wanted to remove Saddam Hussein, and ultimately it's the United States government that's at fault.
Right, and the fact that Bodansky would try to pin this on the White House and on Obama specifically is a key, I think, indicator of the narrative warfare network, even potentially behind this deeper operation. I would think, and I think that what Netanyahu is laying out here is suggestive of some kind of architecture of knowing exactly how they were going to pull this all off to some extent. Now, I'm not say I don't have the forensics to say to point at another, away from Assad or towards Netanyahu in terms of the gas attack itself. I'm not saying that specifically. I haven't done the forensics on that in a long time, actually, and so I don't know. I do know that there were reports that the Israeli special forces services, probably Sayeret Matkal itself, right, behind reconnaissance behind enemy lines in conjunction with Unit 8200, had set up talking what they call talking rocks in Syria during in prior to this time with the run up of the Syrian civil war, that they had in place the ability, similar to what it looks like they did that Israeli security services did in Libya in the 80s, prior to the bombing of Gaddafi, after very likely a false flag discotheque bombing against marine targets in Germany, that they were there as a Trojan horse to communicate potentially false signals that are then used to pin false flags on the target. So that's one piece of forensics that I am aware of in terms of potential high-level Israeli security state involvement in the parameters for pinning potentially a false flag event on their target in Syria.
And on top of that, just thinking about the flow of information and with regards to this narrative, you might say, well, okay, uh, Joseph Bodansky put together an article about the chemical weapons and asking, like, is the White House involved in this? And it goes to global research. Well, maybe that doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But I would think that, like with a lot of other things we identify, this would be one arm of probably to some extent or another, organized at some level or another operation within certain media, within certain circles of activism. And so I'm thinking about how the narrative shifted after this chemical weapons deal to get rid of Syria's chemical weapons deal was struck. The narrative goes from, well, Obama soft in not taking action on the red line that he put in place, that if Syria uses these weapons, well, he's backtracking and he's soft on that. And it goes from that to, well, look at the rise of the next level of radical Islamic terrorism, as Tulsi Gabbard constantly criticized Obama for not being able to say those words while he was still president. In Syria and Iraq with the rise of ISIL/ISIS. And so the narrative goes from he's soft on that to he's soft on this. And I think that you get something like this in play. It's helping set the framework, I think, for what would become Michael Flynn being a key person propagating what ultimately becomes Donald Trump's statement that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton are the mother and father of ISIS, respectively. And so in this time period, you've also got, through the pages of a website such as WorldNet Daily, you've got people like Michael Malouf and Paul Vallely writing about the situation in Syria. So I think there's an organized, this would be an example of perhaps an organized, to some level or another, media narrative arc that shifting a narrative arc that goes from the soft on the red lines to soft on terrorism, and the parameter goes from the chemical weapons to not taking action against the terrorists that ultimately the Obama administration and Clinton State Department might have actually created after all. So I think this is instructive in terms of like a narrative warfare arc that ultimately reaches the soon-to-be president of the United States via his national security advisor. It's something that had been put in place, I think, for a couple of years there. And it definitely, you can see that it benefits these same Likud elements that benefited from the stated goal of removing Syria's chemical weapons program.
Definitely, I think that's a key point. Actually, is that I would see Bodansky's article. Did the White House help plan the Syrian chemical attack? Then translated to the alt media world through global research as very similar and maybe a precedent for Michael Flynn popularizing and really pushing to the world the idea of Obama as the father ISIS, and the connection of this deep Israeli connection. Now, Bodansky is, I believe, a long-term Israeli military intelligence operative of some sort. I think it's very likely. But then his analysis is very friendly for this Russian sphere, right? And then Michael Flynn comes in. Michael Flynn also direct connections with the Israeli security state. He worked for an NSO, Israeli military intelligence corporate cutout affiliate. He was deeply involved with the Cambridge Analytica operation. People should go look at John Swynn's Expose the Enemy channel for further analysis on these recent journalistic revelations about the Jorge Jorge project in terms of Israeli intelligence involvement in Cambridge Analytica. And then Michael Flynn, obviously one of the most public probably in the Russian state media sphere. Most obvious, his RT appearance. He was dissuaded from doing that, there was an attempt to dissuade him from even people in the Michael Ledeen sphere. We believe Michael Ledeen's daughter tried to dissuade Flynn from even going to the RT event, which made him famous as a very likely media tool of Russian state propaganda. So this is an interesting intersection here from Bodansky to Flynn, from the message of Obama architected the Syrian chemical weapons attack to Obama is the father of ISIS, and both the characters portraying this are Americans suspended between the deep Israeli security state and the Russian deep Israeli deep state, I'd say, deep security state. So I think that's a good point, Greg. All right, let's get back to Bibi's take on all of this. Bibi, My Story by Benjamin Netanyahu, page 499. The entire world was shocked by the footage of little children suffocating to death. All eyes were on Obama. He was scheduled to make a dramatic announcement. Minutes before going on air, he called me. Bibi, he said, I've decided to take action, but I need to go to Congress first. I was astonished. American law did not require such an appeal. Syria was not about to go to war with the United States, but Congress was unlikely to approve military action anyway. I hid my disappointment and rebounded with an idea that Energy Minister Yuval Steinitz had raised earlier with Ron Dermer and me in the event that Obama wouldn't attack. Unquote. By the way, remember this. This is very interesting. The energy minister getting involved here, because remember, this is a whole part of the question of the war, Iraq. The war for oil for Israel analysis that we've been talking about since the Gary Vogler's book, Iraq and the Politics of Oil, came out, and pointed that even this oil part of the Iraq war impetus was directly connected to the very same, really, the same cell, the same uh, Office for Special Plans cell, the Feith cell in the Pentagon that had architected the false intelligence for the Iraq war, based around machinations for oil in relationship to Israel, with Syria playing a key role geographically in all of that. So this is more forensics proving out this case in terms of the clean break wars. And we really need to bring it back to clean break wars rather than regime change wars or dumb war, good wars, bad wars, wars of necessity, wars of what was that one, that distinguished one by the head of CFO?
Wars of necessity, wars of choice.
Yes, exactly.
That was Richard Haas, right?
Yes, Richard Haas. And so I think that is crucial to bring back into the fold here, to really understand the geopolitics of these Middle East wars from from Syria to Iraq specifically in terms of very, very, very directed and targeted interests in terms of that go to the place in the Pentagon where the Iraq War was planned.
Mhm. And I think you can see in place here, basically Netanyahu basically acknowledged that we were planning in the case of Obama going soft on this, and put together what we're about to read here as another option without taking the military action against Syria as a means of settling this. So in that case, there's a planning. Oh well, what if he goes soft here? Well, we've got this up our sleeve, and it allows that narrative to keep in place that yeah, he's weak, he's hopelessly weak, and meanwhile getting what you want still out of the administration.
Yes. All right. Quote, I hid my disappointment and rebounded with an idea that Energy Minister Yuval Steinitz had raised earlier with Ron Dermer and me in the event that Obama wouldn't attack. The Russian military was in Syria to shore up the Assad regime and protect Russian assets in Syria, such as the strategic Russian naval base in Latakia or Latakia. There was a fact we could do, that was a fact we could do little to change. But Putin shared with us and the United States a desire to prevent chemical weapons from falling into the hands of Islamic terrorists who pose a threat to Russia too. Quote, why don't you get the Russians with your approval to take out the chemical stockpiles from Syria, unquote, I suggested to the president. Quote, we would back that decision, unquote. This is in fact what transpired in the coming months, though some materials for chemical weapons were still left in Syria. Yet, despite these positive results, the lingering effect of Obama's last-minute turn to Congress was the impression that red lines can be crossed with impunity and that Obama would not employ America's massive air power even when the situation warranted it. Unquote. Maybe this was around earlier, but I've never heard about this call from Obama to Bibi right before Obama made his public announcement. I've never heard specifically of the Israeli prime minister having a plan for what to do in case Obama didn't uh, bomb Syria. And more, I actually see this is actually what the real goal was here. They really wanted, that was the main focus here, was to get the Russians to help take the chemical weapons out of the Syrian hands. All right, we're now on page 500 of Bibi, My Story by Benjamin Netanyahu. All right, so Netanyahu says, why don't you get the Russians with your approval to take out the chemical stockpiles from Syria? I suggested the president, we would back that decision. Okay, I should have expected this. The second important and telling exchange between Obama and me during his visit to Israel happened in private and gave me a heads up on how he viewed the use of American power. The day after the intimate dinner at the Prime Minister's residence, we met at a King David hotel suite overlooking the old city of Jerusalem. I argued again for an American strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. America could still stop Iran from developing atomic bombs that would endanger America, Israel, and the peace of the entire world. An American action now would give an enormous boost to the standing of the U.S. and its president. Obama's response floored me and Itzik Molko, who sat beside me. Quote, Bibi, he said, nobody likes Goliath. I don't want to be an 800-pound gorilla strutting on the world stage. For too long we acted that way. We need to lead in a different way, unquote. I was stunned. In the Middle East, as I knew it, with Iran racing to nuclear weapons and with the shifting geopolitical balance towards Asia, I would want to be a 1,200-pound gorilla, not an 800-pound one. Often, when I met officials of the Obama administration, they waxed lyrical about the marvels of soft power. Culture, values, even Hollywood can do wonders to change the world, they said. Quote, soft power is good, I acknowledge, but hard power is even better, unquote. By hard power, I meant the judicious use of formidable military or economic power, or both, unquote. I just want to just point out that what what the Obama administration actually did in terms of Iran would actually be defined as hard power by Bibi here, right? The Obama administration authorized Stuxnet, basically wielding cyber power, the first sort of big state-sponsored cyber weapon at this scale that's been acknowledged in relationship to the West, right? And remember that was the NSA worked together with the Israeli Unit 8200 in that. And the accusation after the fact by the NSA was that the Israelis had escalated the virality of Stuxnet so that it escaped just the targeted Siemens controllers inside of the Iranian nuclear program and escaped to industrial controllers, Siemens controllers around the world. It was found by cyber investigators. And then additionally, where else did Netanyahu react to the Obama administration's what he calls obsession with soft power was in the Iran nuclear deal. So you could see Netanyahu specifically says formidable military or economic power or both, which is exactly what the Obama administration actually deployed. They deployed the military power in a cyber fashion, getting in bed with the Unit 8200 for Stuxnet. And that was apparently successful in terms of the target and having the centrifuges spin out of control and break down and setting back the Iranian nuclear program in that context. And then economically, the hard power was the Iran nuclear deal, which would maybe seen as soft by Netanyahu because it was beyond sanctions, but it was actually the application of the reassertion of U.S. economic power by bringing the Iranians back into the American economic fold, right? And so the Obama administration actually did use hard power as defined by Netanyahu. But what we see is that Netanyahu was actually after something that would seem to me would again alienate the United States from Iran. Obviously, straight up a air war on Iran that would be seen as just a total act of war. And then economically, this is basically a threat to the Russia-China Belt Road Eurasian Reassertion Initiative to reincorporate Iran only into their sphere. And so this is actually what I think is going on deep under the surface here, because Obama seemed to have responded directly to Netanyahu's directly stated concerns in terms of Iran. And then also we'll see later that he also responded to the question of long-term Israeli security in relationship to the quote unquote Palestinian problem. And that also gets apparently disrupted, it looks like. And there are suggestions in the text, I think, that parts of the disruption of that do go between Bibi and Putin and Tel Aviv and Moscow. And then this, of course, then brings in Flynn as an actual operator inside of the 11/9 operation in the period between the election and the inauguration, 2016 into 2017.
Right. And this is hard power, just not in the way that benefits Netanyahu, et cetera, agenda. So it's deemed soft power.
Yeah. All right. Top of page 501 of Bibi My Story. Quote, the values of individual liberty and national freedom give meaning and strength to free societies, but they are not enough. Power has the unfortunate quality of not being limited to the morally superior and the well-intentioned. If malign forces amass enough of it and have the will to use it, they will overcome the less well-armed forces of good, especially if the good lack the tenacity to fight. Being a moral people won't save you from conquest and carnage, which was the history of the Jewish people for 2,000 years. Being perfect victims who harmed no one, we were perfectly moral. Perfectly moral.
Goodness sake.
That's wild, dude. Okay. Being utterly powerless. Bibi will never be my rabbi. This is not a serious spiritual moral man to say that a whole people for thousands of years of history were perfectly moral. Okay. I would say the prophetic Jewish tradition is in line with the idea that a longer term relationship with God in this case takes prophetic lashing out against the people themselves to wake them up from their immoral ways. But so this is a Zionist theology. This is a Zionist theology and a Zionist revisionist history. A blood and iron, I would say, a blood and iron version of actual like real, mature Jewish theology and history by Netanyahu.
And we talked about this a little bit when we were discussing the interview Netanyahu did with Jordan Peterson of things that kind of bring this Zionist mentality, aligns it with American elements of like the American exceptionalist narrative agenda or mindset. And we've been angels. We've done nothing wrong in the world. And it's similar to like this idea that a white European, Americans, European civilization, we haven't done bad things in the world. It's just that everybody else wants to say we've done bad things in the world and play the victim. So I think there's a coming together of ideological outlooks here in terms of how the more hardline Zionists and the American exceptionalists, Western exceptionalists view themselves and their status in the world and over the course of history.
And we pointed out years ago that this parallel between the destructive aspects of the rhetorical assault on truth and justice that is proclaimed, I think, in the twin pillars of American exceptionalism and American innocence, right? Those two sort of go hand in hand in many ways. That's paralleled by uh, Zionist supremacism and Zionists, in this case, I would say moral perfectionism, right? And so those are very much related to each other, and those then stand in the way. They not only help mask historical evils that have done by your own, whether no matter what you consider your own. But it also, I would say, gets in the way of the much more mature and much more powerful and moral concepts of things like um, the aspirations of a national goodness, let's say, or national leadership, or international leadership, right? So the actual expressed forms of mature national power, which would be in relationship to aspiring to act as a good faith, at the very least good faith, but also potentially a morally good actor in the world, combined with expressing one's power through leadership, through enlightened self-interest and leadership in the world, right? And so then you have this twin pillar of rhetorical destruction of American innocence and American exceptionalism, then in hand in glove in many ways, or hand in hand with Zionist supremacism and Bibi's assertions of long-term, a Zionist view of eternal Jewish moral perfection of some sort. All right. 501 of Bibi, My Story by Benjamin Netanyahu. Quote, being perfect victims who harmed no one, we were perfectly moral. Being utterly powerless, we were led to the slaughter again and again. The rise of Zionism was meant to correct this flaw by giving the Jewish people the power to defend themselves. Enhancing this capacity was the central mission of my years in office. Great empires throughout history, including the Romans and the Mongols, could rise and rule for centuries because they understood the need for overwhelming power. The United States, the most powerful force in modern times, could only ensure the constancy of its own superiority and the supremacy of its values if it continually nurtured its power and the will to use it when necessary. Obama's extraordinary statement confirmed for me two things. First, he wanted to depart from the post-war American policy of peace through strength. He wanted peace through understanding. This wasn't a result of personal weakness. It stemmed from his belief that the projection of American power had caused more harm than good. Unquote. By the way, American power. I mean, again, sort of dismissing the more nuanced question of the deployment of different aspects of American power. Yeah, Obama, came in as having been opposed to the Iraq War, which Bibi to this day seems to have forgotten the date of it and his own role in agit propaganda and mongering the war to the Congress on behalf of the entire Israeli mind, really. And it's very hard to find someone, a legitimate, citizen, analyst, interested person in the United States, really, who really believes that the Iraq War was a good use of American power. And Bibi, of course, wants to whitewash that all, and while then undermining any other potential approach to the assertion of American power in this case. All right. I mean, I think it's credible and fair to accuse Bibi of being a key propaganda monger of the key, probably the key. Let's just put aside suspicions around him in 9/11. That's massive too. But then the war on terror continues, and that's the war that Tulsi Gabbard supports, even if she's
Yep.
against the regime change, TM wars. But then the Iraq War, you could say that Netanyahu is a core operative for helping, prod the United States, along with others more domestically involved, into probably the worst deployment, the most negative and
Mhm.
destructive deployment of American hard power in his case in the 21st century.
Yep. And hard power that goes in the opposite direction, that would be to fulfill another counter agenda, um, is soft and unacceptable. And even if it is actually going to maybe even help make things quote unquote more safe when it comes to the Iranian issue, it's unacceptable. And I'm not saying that's necessarily the end goal, but an actual use of like diplomatic um, hard power is not acceptable, and it's the epitome of being soft and the epitome of completely capitulating.
Very good point. I mean, because obviously the 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 BB plan that was then implemented by Trump after the 11/9 operation, especially in relationship to Iran, we pointed out over and over again. Trump made it very clear. The earliest point that he made about why he was running for president was it's a really bad deal. I could make a much better deal, the Iran deal. It's got to go. And the blowing up of that plan has been really bad for American power, really. I mean, and also in terms of what you said too, if Bibi was actually interested in the question of the Iranian nuclear program, now the Iranians now are well on their way to the refinement of nuclear materials to be able to actually make a bomb, rather than focused on nuclear power in a way that was engaged and involved in the quote unquote international community, with the United States at the head of both the diplomatic and economic efforts.
It's almost as if someone like Netanyahu wants that capacity to be there and be increased, while he constantly talks about his desire to make sure it doesn't exist.
Yes. And this was one of the points I made too, in terms of when I called into C-SPAN, when then Congressman Mike Pompeo was on. He was not yet to become the CIA director or the Secretary of State, but I pointed out that for 10 years at least, every 6 months we hear the Israeli, state apparatus of, people, I think I call it the deep state, the Israeli deep state, come on and tell us we're 6 months away from Iranian bomb, 6 months away from an Iranian bomb. And now actually we probably actually are now, because of probably the whole 11/9 operation, Trump, Bibi, Putin, all of it. But of course, this is Bibi's geopolitical strategy of tension, obviously, for probably numerous reasons.
There was a meme for a while of Netanyahu as Wile E. Coyote making the point of the Iranian nuclear program that I think played off of that idea of like the imminent bomb is coming. It's imminent. It was imminent in the 90s, it was imminent in the 2000s, and it's imminent now. So that meme's been out there for a bit.
Right, and I think it was based on his appearance at the UN, the infamous one where he stared at everybody for a minute, and had some kind of cartoon representation of the threat of the coming Iranian bomb in that way. So yeah, so all right, let's finish up this chapter. We have two more e- events that are, I think, key to understanding this recent historical timeline in terms of how we got here, and then also what's going on right now, especially geopolitically. And so we'll finish up this one. I think this is a crucial one, and then we'll be able to finish the next two in our second half of this. So and that'll then have been able to uh, glean a few key points out of Bibi's book that I feel actually add a good bit in terms of our forensic historical understanding of our geopolitical moment. All right, page 501 of Bibi My Story by Benjamin Netanyahu. Quote, he wanted peace through understanding. This wasn't a result of personal weakness. It stemmed from his belief that the projection of American power had caused more harm than good. He truly viewed himself as, quote, a citizen of the world, unquote, aka a George Soros globalist, as his son would probably put up a meme and include Ehud Barak in it, and then get high fived by Daily Stormer Andrew Meyer Amschel Anglin in terms of all of that whole incident.
Indeed. Yeah.
He's dog whistling all of this, as we pointed out last time. He's dog whistling on memes that became crucial
Mhm.
talking points, weaponized in both the run up to the 11/9 operation, but the ongoing operation itself, or wake of it. I don't know how we would talk about it, but
And you can see where this idea of being a quote unquote citizen of the world is considered a threat, both by like the Netanyahu Zionist forces and then the American racially, culturally oriented nationalist types, at least profess themselves to be nationalists, and that, yeah, it's bad for, you can't use hard power if you're a citizen of the world. You have to have your no national interest at stake. And citizen of the world means he's just going to flood you with the third world into your country because he doesn't care about borders and all that. So another area where this ideological consistency comes together with these the Western quote unquote nationalists and the Zionist quote unquote nationalists.
and even though that was the direct result of the clean break wars in terms of Europe, was exactly that. And
Yeah.
Netanyahu's at the core of all of that. And then remember Orban, a key, articulator of the anti-George Soros, open border globalist types trying to take down your country, and how deeply he's involved with the Putin BB axis. And also, as we pointed out over and over, Arnon Milchan's buddy Andy Vanya, operating
Yep.
in Hungary to authoritarianize the Hungarian media. All right, bottom of page 501 of BB My Story. Quote, As such, he wanted to reach a broad international consensus on pivotal issues that he believed would be shared by all or most major powers. This necessarily detracted from America's traditional global prominence and was interpreted as weakness by Iran and other powers that didn't share his view. My second take from this conversation was that the chances of an American military action against Iran's nuclear facilities under Obama were practically nil. Even if he built an American military option, he was unlikely to use it preemptively, and the Iranians would know it. This meant he would conduct negotiations with them on their nuclear capabilities without the most important card up his sleeve. Unquote. Before we reach the final page here, I mean, it's wild, especially with like Bibi as probably the premier uh, advertising marketer for Israeli cyber power, which comes directly out of its military. That Obama decided not to use bombs, but decided to use a cyber weapon, the kind that Bibi would recognize because he passed it out all over these kinds of cyber weapons all over the world, especially in terms of targeting journalists and human rights activists and dissident Washington Post journalists like Jamal Khashoggi. So Netanyahu knows that he proclaims that cyber power is at the core of the connection between Israeli hard and soft power in many ways. But for Bibi, it's all about the age of iron. It's iron domes, it's iron bombs, it's blood and soil. All right. Last page of chapter 502 of Bibi, My Story by Benjamin Netanyahu. Quote, hiding my despondency, I accompanied Obama to Ben Gurion Airport. Before he boarded Air Force One, we had one more stop. The Americans had urged us to finish the Mavi Marmara affair.
Mm.
You remember, Greg?
Yes, the
Flotilla.
Gaza flotilla.
Yes, and where there were Turkish citizens and Americans that were that were both harmed. Some were killed, I think. All right, by the Israeli Navy, I think. And that was a sort of a civil disobedience, breaking of the Gaza blockade with purely humanitarian resources. And the Israeli Navy reacted with hard power, iron power. And now this was a mess in the case of American diplomats. They were hoping that the Israelis would wrap it up and, finish paying off the victims and victims' family members. Quote, we had already reached a compensation agreement with Turkey for the families of the Turks killed in the operation. What was needed now was a carefully worded script for a concluding conversation between Erdogan and me. As extra insurance against a future abandonment of the agreement by Erdogan, I asked Obama to be in on the phone conference. He did so from a special mobile cabin at the airport. Quote, Recep, how are you, my friend? The president said to Erdogan. How's the wife? How's the family? Unquote. The genuine camaraderie in his voice tallied with what I had heard. One of Obama's closest friends among foreign leaders was the Turkish president. Possibly, Greg, you want to say something?
Oh, I was just saying that's interesting.
Yeah. Possibly because in Obama's eyes, Turkey was an example of a modern, successful, and democratic Islamic state. Presumably, this friendship later weakened when, following an attempted coup against him on July 15th, 2016, it's an interesting date too, I forgot about that, Erdogan transformed Turkey into a rigidly authoritarian regime, locked up all his political opponents, and threw more journalists in jail than almost any other ruler on earth. Erdogan and I read our lines. Erdogan and I each read our lines. I thanked Obama. The Marmara affair was finally settled. Despite this, and despite the fact that Mossad provided intelligence to Turkey that prevented at least half a dozen terrorist attacks on Turkish soil, our relations with Turkey did not fully recover. Though trade continued at relatively high levels, Israeli tourism, once booming, tapered off. Erdogan kept attacking Israel and me on a regular basis as enemies of Islam. This was good politics in Turkey, and he probably believed it. Close to a decade later, as Turkey's economy began to wobble, he would begin to change his tone and soften somewhat his attitude to Israel. Unquote. End of chapter.
Interesting description of the evolution of Erdogan and whatever's going on there.
Definitely. I mean, and this is, we've noted too, that this shifting of Turkey or Turkey and Erdogan in relationship between NATO and Russia and all of that has been probably one of the foremost questions in terms of what is Erdogan doing. And, in this case, you can imagine that Obama's intent was to deploy American soft power to help keep Turkey in the fold to some extent. And so I'd be interested in some of the more behind the scenes aspects behind Erdogan softening to Israel, as Bibi says, becoming a little bit closer with it. And we briefly mentioned at some point that there was a much more apparently legitimate and organic Turkish nationalist political movement that's in a very similar kind of way that you had the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and Syria that appeared to be an undermining of earlier pan-Arab nationalism. Uh, that something like that is what Erdogan represents in terms of actual, maybe less still Islamic, but also more a pan-Arab nationalist approach in Turkey, where you now have this very dubious character like Erdogan. All right. Let's call it an episode there, and we will get back to this and finish up these key other points from the book Bibi as I think a very helpful precursor to getting back into the actual question of the 11/9 operation and the ongoing cover-up of it, and how much it plays into everything that's going on now geopolitically, and even as we begin to turn towards the Rage Against the War Machine rally that just took place over the weekend, and then other aspects of that, Ukraine and Russia, the escalation in relationship to Iran. We need to know the actual context here, and the historical facts, the truth of the matter, to actually understand what's all going on here. So I think that will help us. We'll finish that up, then we'll get back into to actually finishing the last part of chapter 4 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson, and then we'll be able to move into some more current aspects.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. And we'll get back to this very soon.
All right. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, everybody out there. We appreciate you. Until next time, AnteDote, we are out.